The composition of the board or its structure isn't the only thing that will affect how well the board performs. In fact, some would argue while it might be the base, it needs to be kept in balance with two other factors. Let's move to the second of those now, board dynamics. So if we're going to talk about dynamics, we need to think about board effectiveness and what it is. So really one way to think about it is that it can occur at three levels. So at the first level, it's about the product of the board or what the board actually does. Is the board fit for purpose? Can the board monitor to the level that it needs to, provide advice, provide access to resources, develop strategy? All those things we talked about in terms of the board role, can the board deliver on those things? However, if a board's going to do that effectively, then it also needs to operate effectively as a group. And so that's like a different level of analysis. At one level, we're talking about the outputs or the outcomes from a board. At the second, we're talking about the group members working together. So they can talk about things like having robust relationships, trust, mutual respect, great discussions where people challenge. They're all the hallmarks of the group operating effectively. And then finally, we have the individual director level. So if we're going to have an effective group, then we need individual director behaviours. So in this area, we can think about things like directors being well prepared, good communicators. So they're all these issues that the individual needs to bring if the group's going to be effective. Of course, these areas overlap, but when we say we've got an effective board, or perhaps even more importantly, an ineffective board, we really need to discern and think about what we're talking about in terms of ineffectiveness. Is it ineffectiveness of role execution, ineffectiveness of group dynamics, or ineffectiveness of an individual that's causing these problems? That's one of the reasons that we need to ask this question about who's responsible when we're talking about governance. You know, who is responsible for corporate actions or board actions or an individual? Our work when we were looking at the stuff from Milgram, etc., says that the context affects individuals' behaviour. Now, that's not trying to excuse them and from being held to account for that behaviour, but recognising that the approach and the context that people find themselves in will affect their behaviour. So it's all of these things together that affect the behaviour. And that's why when there's a failure in governance, whether it's at the corporate action level or the board level or the individual level, I think it's really useful to sit back and go, hey, did I in any way contribute to this? For instance, did I encourage debate enough? Did I not step in when I should have as an individual? These are all questions I think that an effective director will ask in an effective governance system. This kind of logic is a great segue into a famous quote by Nell Minow about the problems that can occur on boards. The fact that you can get these really high-performing, successful business people or people with lots of different backgrounds actually that are well-known in their field, put them together on a board and something seems to go wrong. They seem to be making these decisions which you look back on and go, how did that happen? And that's where how they operate together and the dynamics comes to overpower the individual composition of the board. To understand how this occurs, we need to look a little bit more deeply into the board dynamics and the board processes that are actually taking place. We're going to look at the specific processes and policies that are in place next, but before we do that, we just need to have a little think about board dynamics itself. The starting point is to think about what you want to have happen in governance. And these points come from an article by Finkelstein and Mooney, which is one of the first articles ever to start addressing this kind of dynamics issue. So what we really want out of an effective board and an effective governance system is constructive conflict or debate, but not destructive where people undermine each other. That means we've got to work as a team. We also have to be involved at the appropriate level strategically and to make decisions. So that's really a lot of what we want from a board is good decisions. How do we do that? We need the right people. Okay, so that's the composition that we've dealt with. But we also need to make sure that the way they operate, the way we structure meetings works well, that they stage it, that we have the information ready, and that they're guided in the decision process itself to make as an effective decision as what we can. This is often far less about the rules and the systems and processes, but how people work together. And I just point you to that Sonnenfeld article, which looks at what can we do to help boards develop this climate that we need, trust, open dissent, how we can get accountability in our system through engaging directors by giving them specific roles. And we do those roles either individually, although we have to be careful there that they don't step into management. We can do it individually, or often we do this through their roles in committees. And then do we have some form of feedback mechanism, right? All individuals and groups need feedback if they're going to improve. So how do we actually evaluate our board's performance and how we're operating becomes one of those critical steps in getting an effective dynamic in the boardroom. Often the main issue that we're trying to address in the dynamics is bias in decision making. And what we have listed here are a whole group of biases that we know affect logical decision making. We have group level biases such as groupthink, risky shift and polarization. In fact, there's a great paper by Zhu on polarization in merger and acquisition decisions. But we also see individual level decisions, free riding or social loafing, depending upon whether you're a sociologist or an economist. You know, how does that come out? Maybe board members don't read their papers. Okay, that's a form of social loafing or bias that we see due to the group process involved in governance. So a lot of what we're doing by putting in place policy and process is trying to overcome or to cancel out these biases by making people get the papers early, trying to encourage them to read the papers and to exchange freely their ideas to overcome the bias of any one individual. Because we know that groups often can overcome the bias in individual decision making. It's only going to occur, however, where we have an effective group process. This is a very old model. It's a classic Tuckman from 1965. I like it because I can remember it because it rhymes. But essentially, all groups go through development stages. Now, things have moved on from Tuckman, but in a sense, the key idea for us, we're not doing an organisational psychology course, but the key thing for us to remember is that groups of people behave differently when they are at different levels of development. So often we can see these stages, right? In a forming stage, people are often really polite, right? No one wants to say the wrong thing, so they don't raise difficult issues. Right? That often happens when a group comes together for the first time, or it can often happen in the boardroom because people don't work together a lot. What people have to do is move beyond that forming stage. Now, a necessary stage, but somewhere where you don't want to stay, is a storming stage. Okay, so in a storming stage, that is where we do have disagreement. But the problem is we have no way of resolving that disagreement. So we get this storming behaviour. Now, what we're hoping that we can do is develop a norm, right? This is how we constructively operate and argue. And that's really necessary. You know, how do we disagree and resolve those differences between us? That's a norm. If we don't do this, if we have too much storming and remain here, then what we can often see is that directors resign or they shut up and stop raising the difficult issues. All behaviours that we don't want to see. We actually want people to have this constructive debate and decide the things that we want. So really a lot of policy and process in a governance setting is about defining what we need to do and how we're going to operate and agree and disagree and resolve differences to develop these norms, because it's highly unlikely to develop naturally in a group that meets 10 to 12 times a year for, say, half a day and with different people, right, with a diverse background. So that's why governance often focuses on this norm development. What kinds of norms do these policies approach? Well, the first one is they try to counter normal tendencies. So these normal tendencies, most people seek harmony, not dissent. So we need to have one way of encouraging people to disagree. But we need to encourage them to disagree in an agreeable way. Yeah. So that's about codes of behaviour, and also how we facilitate the discussion and how we treat them when they do disagree with us. The second issue is that most people tend to react, right? That when the phone rings, they pick it up and answer it no matter what they're doing. They react to a stimulus. Boards are often set up to do that. You get papers that you react to. So often, many aspects of governance policy are about planning ahead, so that we are thinking and being active rather than just reacting to what managers would like. And the third area is boundary behaviours. These are things that will upset people. So what is it? This is about how we act. And they're the three kinds of norms that a lot of governance policy and process focuses on. Of course, it's not just about the board here. It's actually about the board and management working together in sharing these norms. If they are the norms that we want developed at the boardroom, the next step becomes, well, what kind of policy and processes do we need to put in place to try and help develop these dynamics and effective behaviours in the boardroom?